Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Expression, and Sex Characteristics, or SOGIESC study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I'm your consultation moderator for this session, and this is our 16th thematic consultation topic so far. This is the second in a series of 3 regional consultations and discussions on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, or SOGIESC. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, a director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the Asian Development Bank, and also by Mr. Oliver Chapman, Senior Social Development Specialist, also within SDCC, and Tony Jo Lebos, a Senior Consultant on SOGIESC, working directly with the ADB and Oliver Chapman, as well as other specialists within the ADB. Our moderator for the Q&A session is Heidi-Eerd Dupuy, the head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Asian Development Bank. Other experts will also be on hand for the Q&A session from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, and I know they look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. This is our second interactive consultation on the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, and it builds on the previous sessions on gender as well as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment that we had last week and the week before that. A note that we will be extensive with our use of SOGIESC as an acronym in English to denote sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. You may also hear speakers use the term SEA, which denotes sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. We ask both participants as well as simultaneous interpreters to take note of these acronyms. For this consultation, Oliver Chapman and Tony Jo Lebos will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on SOGIESC and the relationship of this to the gender and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment study presented last week and the week before, as all of these studies pertain to the Safeguards Policy Update and are connected. From these presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of ADB's Safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, the ADB is recording this session for the purpose of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please ensure you're joining us from a quiet and distraction-free area, and please ensure that your microphone is off when not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. Heidi-Eerd Dupuy will then ask that you unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. As we are all colleagues here and we may have different points of view, I urge you to all be respectful to one another. And Heidi-Eerd Dupuy and I will manage time to ensure that we remain within our consultation schedule. IT support is provided throughout this consultation, and you may ask for support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we are using today. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important Zoom buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation available today in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen. If we could have the next slide, please. No, I'm sorry, it's the right slide. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen and select your preferred language. Press the mute original audio button so that you can clearly hear the voice of your interpreter. For those of you listening in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, if you feel any of the native English speakers are speaking too fast and you would prefer us to slow down, you can ask us to do so by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button, you can then press the slow down button, which is the two reverse arrows pointing to your left in white, and this will let us English speakers know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name in Zoom, click on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then on the right-hand side of the screen, look for your own name. Then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. Click on the Rename button and type in your name, the agency you represent, your preferred gender pronoun if you wish, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the reactions button, and then click on the raise hand emoji. To speak, when invited to do so, unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon, and then to show your video, again, if you wish to do so, click on the video icon. The next set of slides shows how we value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. So let me refer you to the slides directly and encourage you to read them. I'm not going to read them, but just a reminder that these sessions are being recorded and documented and subsequently will be distributed for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen. If you have any issues or concerns on the recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of the consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through the email address that is at the bottom of the screen or in the chat box now. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks and provide a context for this sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristic study. Mr. Dunn is a director of the Safeguards Division in ADB Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Secondly, Mr. Oliver Chapman will provide an overview of how specifically the SAIA issues relate to the gender work and the policy imperatives being implemented by the ADB. This will frame the discussion on SOGIESC specifically and allow us to engage on issues of how SOGIESC, as well as the previously discussed SAIA and gender issues, can be considered in the Safeguards Policy Update. Oliver is likely known to many of you and is a senior social development specialist within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. Thirdly, we will follow on from Oliver's presentation with a presentation by Tony Jo Lebos, a senior consultant on SOGIESC, working directly with the ADB. Tony Jo will detail some of the SOGIESC study findings and key issues, including a comparator analysis and some of the performance standards and requirements and how these relate to the revision of the current safeguards policy and might also be considered in the revised safeguards policy as specifically related to the issue of SOGIESC. After the presentations by Bruce, Oliver, and Tony, we will take a brief 5-minute break where I will ask you to think about some feedback on the presentations and these consultations in general, offering us some advice on how the consultations and our engagement with you might be improved. Finally, when we return from the break and as a culmination of the previous presentations, we will have an open discussion on the sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics issues raised in the presentations, as well as the study summary paper, which has been emailed to all pre-registered participants and continues to be available as a download from the various ADB websites, including the Safeguard Policy website. This will be facilitated and moderated by Heidi Eer-Dupuis, who is the head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. A reminder that you may also ask your questions during this moderated Q&A session in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese, either in the chat box or through raising your hand as previously explained in the Zoom functions live. Heidi will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversations for the discussion we will have. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn of the ADB to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and the contextual overview of the study. Bruce, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim, and good day. Welcome, and thank you so much to all of you for joining this session today, this regional consultation on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics, or SOGIESC for short, as Azim has mentioned. And this session builds on consultations that we've held over the last 2 weeks that have focused more broadly on gender and safeguard issues, as well as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And we're very much looking forward to engaging with you today on the SOGIESC topic. Now, for this session, as you've heard, we have representatives from civil society and other non-government stakeholders, mostly from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And we're very pleased to welcome all of you to this session, of course, no matter where you're joining from. And I'm pleased to see also that for this session, we do have a number of new participants, stakeholders that are joining these consultations on the Safeguard Policy Update for the first time. So let me provide just a little bit of additional background on why we're here. Why are we updating the Safeguard Policy and how are we taking that approach? I'll then provide a little bit of additional context on today's consultation topic on SOGIESC. So firstly, ADB is in the process of updating our 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement. And this policy aims to ensure that projects that the ADB supports or finances do not lead to adverse impacts on the environment or people. And the key objectives of the policy are to avoid, minimize, mitigate, or in some cases, offset adverse impacts on people and the environment, while at the same time working to build the capacity of our developing member countries and other clients that we work with. And this is really essential for us to be able to implement the policy effectively in the diverse range of countries that we work in across Asia and the Pacific. Now, it has been more than 10 years of policy implementation. And to strengthen the approach, ADB's Independent Evaluation Department completed a fairly comprehensive evaluation looking at the effectiveness of the Safeguard Policy. And this was completed in May 2020. And there were 5 key recommendations that were made. The first, probably most fundamental, was that ADB should update and modernize the policy, providing additional clarity on the key requirements and also addressing a number of key gaps. As you can imagine, after more than a decade of implementation, there was a lot to learn. There was implementation experiences, but also many of the other multilateral financial institutions have updated their own policies over that time period. And of course, we need to learn from some of the changes and innovations that have been made in their own policy frameworks, and seek to strengthen and harmonize our own approach with those. Now, there were many topics that were considered as part of this evaluation, but just one that was highlighted was the need to strengthen the integration of gender issues in our safeguards work. So that's something that we're very much committed to doing. The other recommendations were covering a range of topics. One was on developing a more practical approach to the strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. Another was on developing additional guidance to be able to support implementation. The ADB Safeguard Policy Statement basically provides a policy framework, but ADB has not gone through a process of establishing comprehensive or more detailed guidance notes on a number of topics, and that was seen as a gap that we should address. Plus, there were recommendations related to ADB's internal management systems and oversight for safeguards, which the recommendations suggested there was opportunities for strengthening. And the last recommendation related to further work on building our own staff capacity as well as that of our borrowers and clients. So there's quite a number of recommendations. The ADB management then took a proactive approach. All of the recommendations were endorsed, and then management subsequently launched from August 2020 an approach to update the policy. And that's intended to be completed over about a 2.5-year period. At this stage, we have a target to complete the policy update by March 2023. So it's in about 9 months' time. However, we are keeping that date under review, and we may need to add some additional time to complete the policy drafting, as well as having further time available for additional stakeholder consultations. Now, in terms of the process itself, we have been taking a fairly comprehensive approach to studying a series of issues. We've been preparing background analytical studies, which have been benchmarking our own policy against the frameworks of other multilateral financial institutions. And we've also been reviewing lessons learned and implementation experience. And as you've heard from Azim in the opening remarks, we've been presenting these through a range of these regional consultations. And this is in fact the 16th topic that we've covered through this series. We started looking at some of the more traditional areas for safeguards around environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards. And now we're coming to a range of cross-cutting issues, and issues that are very important for addressing risks to vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Now, we undertake these consultations to be able to get feedback from our developing member countries, as well as from civil society and a wider range of groups. And the importance of these sessions is to be able to, firstly, we present some of our thoughts from the studies, but most importantly is to get your views on the issues so that we can feed that back into the policy update process and ultimately look at the different views coming from stakeholders, and hopefully we can end up with a better policy at the end of it. Now, coming to today's topic, so discussions on SOG-yes. Now, at ADB, this has been a topic that we've been working on for a number of years to increase awareness within ADB, to understand the issues, and we've actually been starting to collect more data in the region to try and inform our own approach. But to be honest, I would still say it's very much an emerging issue for ADB, and we are very much looking forward to engaging with many experts, including those from civil society, and thinking more about how we can both take a proactive approach in ADB operations, but also in the context of our safeguards, which we're focusing on here today, how can we ensure that projects will not do any harm to people from a diverse range of communities and backgrounds? We're aware, of course, though, the stigma, discrimination, and violence, and the real risks for people from different sexual and gender minorities, and that this has very much distinct effects that we need to consider in the context of our work and our policy framework. We need to look at how we can integrate risks that are facing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex people into our safeguards to ensure effectively that we do no harm to people from the LGBTQI community. Now, we're very pleased that we've been able to look at some of the emerging practice from other multilateral financial institutions. As you'll hear today, there is emerging practice, but I think it is still early days, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to see how we can implement in practice. We are having increasing collaboration, actually, between multilateral financial institutions on both the wider SOGIES inclusion agenda that is really essential for providing a supportive environment to enable us to explore these issues, but also in terms of the more do no harm agenda through safeguards. Now, with that, just as some broad background, let me now hand over to my colleague, Oliver Chapman. He's going to set the scene a bit more in terms of our understanding of some of the issues facing the region and some of the work that ADB's already doing. And then after that, Tony Jo Lesbos will present more on the benchmarking work. So I'll hand over to Oliver now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce. I'm going to start the presentation by setting the scene with some synthesized knowledge on SOGIESC in Asia and the Pacific. You may have heard some of this information before, but please also bear in mind that it needs to be accessible to our various stakeholders, including government and other clients who are new to the topic. Next slide, please. And so to set the scene on SOGIESC in Asia and the Pacific, evidence suggests that sexual and gender minorities constitute a vulnerable population. Oh, this is the next slide, sorry, just in case you didn't flip. A vulnerable population in the region as they continue to face widespread stigma, discrimination and violence in many of ADB's developing member countries. The history of the region shows rich diversity of SOGIESC, including transgender Babalan shamans of pre-colonial Philippines, third gender Hijra across South Asia, as well as other identities throughout Asia and the Pacific. Partly due to colonial influences, third gender cultural institutions were undermined and sodomy was criminalized in many countries. Although restrictive laws remain in some countries, some have more recently made or considered legal reforms to support more inclusive approaches to inclusion on the basis of sexuality and gender identity. Today, there are a complex array of laws and regulations that influence inclusion on the basis of SOGIESC, both positively and negatively. A thriving civil society sector operating at both national and regional levels has in recent years been campaigning for liberalization of laws, social attitude change, enhanced service provision, and inclusive practices in the private sector. Next slide, please. So now on to the key risks faced by sexual and gender minorities. Sexual and gender minorities, by virtue of their SOGIESC, may be more likely to be adversely affected by project impacts or more constrained than others in their abilities to take advantage of project benefits. This is because of cross-cutting and cross-sectoral risk factors, including discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV. So on to discrimination. Discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC can be both direct or indirect. Discrimination means creating a distinction, exclusion, or restriction which has the purpose or effect of impairing or excluding a person based on their real or perceived SOGIESC. It affects project benefits, negative impacts, and the opportunity to voice comments or concerns during stakeholder engagement and in grievous redress mechanisms. And on SGBV, sexual and gender minorities are at an elevated risk of sexual and gender-based violence. They often lack the necessary mechanisms to seek justice due to legal and social contexts. These risks are caused and magnified by both social stigma and lack of legal rights in many contexts. Next slide, please. So we had a look at various studies across the region to help enhance our knowledge for this study. And in a study conducted in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam by UNDP, Curtin University, and the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, it was found that cisgender individuals, that's non-transgender people, were 54.5% more likely to be invited to a job interview when compared to transgender individuals having equivalent employment profiles. And a study by ILO and UNDP conducted in China, Philippines, and Thailand found that sexual and gender minorities face, firstly, limited legal protections from discrimination in the workplace. Second, often negative or unequal treatment. And third, have little recourse to remedy mistreatment and discrimination. Next, there are lingering negative beliefs and attitude towards sexual and gender minorities across multiple sectors, including health, education, and employment. And this was a study by UNDP in Thailand. And finally, the World Bank has done a preliminary assessment that sexual and gender minorities are likely overrepresented in the bottom 40% of the population in terms of real per capita income. Next slide, please. And based on the work of Lee Badgett at Massachusetts University Amherst, as well as others, there is evidence of causality linking Soghiesque inclusion to economic and social development. And there are 4 primary drivers of this. First, lower productivity from discrimination in the workplace and wider economy where exclusion persists. And similarly, lower returns on education and training, lost output from health disparities, and inefficient expenditure on social and health services due to the effects of unequal treatment. And these effects and the consequence are reinforced by the assessment that a greater number than is typically assumed are of diverse Soghiesque. And the latest evidence is that somewhere between 5 and 20% of the population are LGBTQI. Next slide, please. ADB and the World Bank are collaborating on a study on the legal barriers faced by sexual and gender minorities. Why are we doing this? Because we feel that legal barriers are foundational. They are specifically challenging for LGBTQI people across Asia and the Pacific and globally. And they're highly relevant for both safeguards and aspirational type development work. And our work differs from various other studies in 2 main ways. Firstly, because it's operationally relevant to multilateral development banks and the business we do. And second, it's highly detailed, which means we can have nuanced findings across specific issues that we can address in our work. There are 165 data points in the study across 6 domains, and the domains are criminalization, access to inclusive education, access to the labour market, access to public services, civil and political inclusion, and protection from hate crimes. And we're partway through data collection, but at a high level, the emerging issues are, firstly, that people with diverse Soghiesque are facing discrimination in all sectors and in all countries, and that some progress is being made in a handful of countries on partnership rights and anti-discrimination provisions in various sectors. And only in Nepal is there data being collected nationally and at the census level on non-cisgender people. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Tony Joe, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the issues we have already picked up from civil society. And of course, we're looking forward to hearing more on this. So first, there is evidence of diminished economic, social, and legal status of sexual and gender minorities across the region. Second, there are specific risk factors, including discrimination, stigma, and violence. That gender norms are critical in risk factors affecting people with diverse Soghiesque. There is a lack of data disaggregation currently, and this has a significant effect on policy and programs. The question of how social impact assessment and action plans could mitigate risks for people of diverse SOGIESC, the importance of intersectionality, which, as many of you know, is about multiple intersecting factors that increase vulnerability and exclusion, and the need for capacity building on SOGIESC with ADB and with governments. The need to address how to carry out meaningful consultations with minority communities, considering lack of visibility, stigma, and discrimination, and the specific vulnerabilities in areas such as labor, discrimination, and resettlement, where people with diverse SOGIESC can be amongst the most marginalized and where they lack voice. And finally, the proposal from various civil society organizations and other in the non-government sector for a standalone standard within our framework on gender equality and SOGIESC. So with that, I'll now hand over to Tony Jo Lebos to talk about the benchmarking study we have carried out of comparator MFIs. Over to you, Tony Jo.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Jo Lebos, and I'm a consultant who has been advising the ADB team in their review of the SPS in relation to SOGIESC. In this section of the presentation, I will talk briefly about a benchmarking study we've conducted and its main findings. Next slide, please. Oliver and Bruce already did a tremendous job at setting up the context of the study, so I will not spend any time repeating what they've already said. Instead, I'll move over to the objectives of the study, which were twofold. First, the objective of the study was to better understand some good practice on SOGIESC inclusion in ADB DMCs and in international development more broadly. So this includes understanding SOGIESC issues in Asia and the Pacific, understanding challenges faced by sexual and gender minorities in the region and more broadly, and understanding the linkages between SOGIESC and economic development. The second purpose is to compare ADB's current policies, strategies, and practices on SOGIESC to those used by peer MFIs. So this second objective includes, first of all, summarizing ADB's coverage of SOGIESC under existing policies, and secondly, conducting a benchmarking of other MFIs and their policies towards SOGIESC. So my presentation will focus primarily on the findings of the study, and particularly as it relates to the second objective. Next slide, please. To start with, how is SOGIESC already included in some of ADB's current policies and strategies? So ADB Strategy 2030, in Operational Priority 1 on addressing remaining poverty and reducing inequalities, recognizes sexual orientation as one of the social aspects that often undermine people's participation, voice, rights, and access to resources and services. Similarly, Operational Priority 2, Accelerating Progress in Gender Equality, requires DMCs, which again stands for Developing Member Countries, to address discrimination against disadvantage for women, including those related to class, ethnicity, indigenous status, sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, age, and migration. Also, while ADB's Operation Manual Section C3BP on incorporation of social dimensions in ADB operation makes no explicit reference to SOGIESC issues, it does list social elements such as gender, ethnicity, race, age, and others that may influence people's decision-making, access to services, resources, opportunities, and ability to cope with risks. ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement from 2009 aims to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse environmental and social impacts, including protecting the rights of those likely to be affected or marginalized by the development process. So although the SPS, so the Safeguard Policy Statement, does not explicitly mention the risks to sexual and gender minorities, it does not exclude them either. The SPS mentions that as part of social impact assessments, it will identify individuals and groups who may be differently or disproportionately affected by the project because of their disadvantaged or vulnerable status. Furthermore, the SPS, under meaningful consultations, also requires the process to be gender inclusive, responsive, and tailored to the needs of the disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. Now moving on to the benchmarking analysis. The benchmarking analysis compares SOGIESC-related policies, standards, and resources present in comparator MFIs. The recently updated MFI safeguard frameworks are using different approaches to address SOGIESC in their operations. So some MFIs have incorporated explicit provisions in the safeguard standards, and others have developed tools, procedures, and good practice notes that can be used during project design and implementation by staff and borrowers. So the benchmarking analysis is thus conducted on 3 key criteria. The first one is the inclusion of SOGIESC provisions in the MFI's policies and standards. The second is the presence of operational SOGIESC-related guidance material for staff and clients. So this includes, for example, guidance notes or good practice notes. And then the third one is the presence of full-time staff focused on providing SOGIESC-related support. Next slide, please. I will start by covering some acronyms for the different MFIs before I dig into the findings. So ADB stands for Asian Development Bank. AIIB stands for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The IFC stands for International Finance Corporation. The IDB stands for the Inter-American Development Bank. And the EBRD stands for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So under the first criteria of inclusion of SOGIESC provisions in the MFI safeguard policies and standards, we find that ADB's SPS 2009 does not have explicit reference to SOGIESC. There are no specific SOGIESC-related safeguard standards or policies in place that mandate the protection of sexual and gender minorities in ADB projects. Among the comparator MFIs, the AIIB's revised environmental and social framework specified its enhanced commitment to gender equality without explicit reference to sexual and gender minorities. Similarly, the World Bank did not make explicit reference to SOGIESC issues in the main body of its environmental and social framework, but provided coverage of sexual and gender minorities as a category of vulnerable and disadvantaged group under its directive on addressing the risks and impacts on disadvantaged and vulnerable individuals or groups. EBRD and IDB explicitly referred to sexual and gender minorities as a vulnerable group. IFC, EBRD, and IDB also include SOGIESC as potential discriminatory grounds in employment under the requirements for labor and working conditions. And further, IDB's environmental and social policy also stresses the need for the client to identify and address risks, impact, and access to opportunities that may disproportionately affect people because of their disadvantaged or vulnerable status, including sexual and gender minorities. It also requires the borrower to provide special measures of protection and assistance to address the vulnerabilities of project workers, including people of diverse SOGIESC, and address measures to prevent and address violence, harassment, intimidation, and or exploitation. It also includes provision to take into account concerns of sexual and gender minorities through the stakeholder engagement process in determining priority services and engages throughout the project lifecycle through meaningful consultations with sexual and gender minorities. Notably, IDB's ESP has more explicit and specific coverage of SOGIESC issues overall. Next slide, please. Under the second criteria relating to the presence of operational SOGIESC-related guidance material for staff and clients, we find that among the MFIs, the ADB, the AIIB, the IFC, the EBRD, and the IDB have not published SOGIESC-specific guidance material for the implementation of the respective safeguard frameworks. The World Bank, however, has developed a good practice note on non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity to support the implementation of its environmental and social framework. So the good practice note guides thinking around SOGIESC issues in development projects and structures implementation support to borrowers in addressing the risk of discrimination. In the good practice note, non-discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC is set out at different stages of the project cycle, including scoping, assessment, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, and lastly, meaningful stakeholder engagement. Other MFIs, such as the IDB, have worked and contributed to SOGIESC-specific research. The IFC, for instance, has published an emerging practice report that elaborates on good practice for advancing the economic inclusion of sexual and gender minorities. And the EBRD has also published various SOGIESC-related research studies. Next slide, please. Lastly, under the third criteria relating to the presence of full-time staff focused on providing SOGIESC-related support, we find that the AIIB, the EBRD, and the IDB do not have full-time staff exclusively working on SOGIESC, but hire consultants on an ad hoc basis for support on SOGIESC-specific tasks. While there are no full-time staff solely focused on SOGIESC issues at the ADB, staff at the institution have supported SOGIESC-related tasks at the request of certain clients. The ADB also hires consultants to support on SOGIESC-specific issues. And then lastly, the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the IFC leads on support for SOGIESC matters in the institution. Staff at the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group typically focus on a set of topics, including gender, SOGIESC, and disability. The World Bank has a global advisor on SOGI, supported by a full-time social development specialist and a small team of consultants. Their work supports the World Bank teams in their proactive agenda on SOGIESC inclusion in projects and support project teams in designing, implementing, and monitoring of projects in accordance to the environmental and social framework of the World Bank. So some key tasks for the advisor of the World Bank include the inclusion of SOGIESC issues in country partnership frameworks and undertaking strategic country diagnostics to generate data and analytics related to SOGIESC. Secondly, capacity building for World Bank staff in headquarters and in country offices on SOGIESC and inclusive development. Third, capacity building to project task team leaders on ESF requirements in relation to SOGI. And then providing resources and tools to project teams and clients to address SOGIESC issues with safeguards. Sorry, I think we're still at the slide before that one. So if you could just go back one slide. And then guidance and advice to senior management on challenging contexts. Okay, I'm done with the slide now. Please move on to the next slide. So based on the study analysis, some issues for further consideration in the SPS review and update include the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities as a category under the definition of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Secondly, the incorporation of SOGIESC-specific provisions in the revised policy and borrower requirements on issues such as labor standards and resettlement. Thirdly, the preparation of tools, guidance notes for screening, scoping, implementation, and monitoring of SOGIESC measures in accordance with the revised SPS. After that, we would be ensuring adequate SOGIESC-specific resources and staffing at the ADB for the implementation and monitoring of SOGIESC issues in accordance with the revised SPS. Providing capacity building on non-discrimination based on SOGIESC to ADB staff and project executing and implementing agencies. And lastly, engaging in regional SOGIESC-specific knowledge generation through partnership with other international organizations and civil society organizations which operate at the regional and country levels. So I will stop my part of the presentation here and hand it back to Azim to introduce the moderated discussion part of the consultation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, and apologies, I think I was on mute there for a second. So thank you, Tony Joe, and to all three presenters, thank you very much. Thanks, Oliver Chapman and Tony Joe Lebos, for your very comprehensive and detailed presentations, and for the overviews on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics issues you've all raised for us to consider. These presentations offer us clarity and present some of the unique challenges which have been raised by ADB's independent evaluation department publicly and need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by around March of 2023. The comparative analysis of SOGIESC presented by Tony Zhou will need to be considered in how the ADB becomes a leader in incorporating SOGIESC issues in the revised safeguards policy. Of particular interest, of course, are the benchmarks and the alignment and the analyses of comparator MFIs to SOGIESC and how the ADB Strategy 2030 and the OP1 and OP2, as well as section C3BP from the operations manual, needs to be inclusive and mainstreamed, as Tony Zhou Lebos mentioned. And we hope we can get to feedback and opportunity to delve into some of these issues during the Q&A session that's coming up. We hope that you will actively participate in this session that runs for between 70 to 75 minutes, but there is going to be some flexibility in that. Just a note before we break and before we start, that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously throughout these consultations, you can please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select the message to Jennifer DeBellin or Niall Aquino, who are members of the team working behind the scenes, and they will then repost your question anonymously to protect your identity. They'll repost it under their names. Let's now pause for a 5-minute break. Before I do, can we please invite you to think about our poll evaluation questions that we will have a little bit later on, but want you to perhaps think about during the break. And the question is related to how effective this consultation was and how satisfied you were by this consultation. There will be 2 longer questionnaires that we'll post the links to in the chat box. One is on menti.com and another is internal to the ADB team to get some feedback. The menti.com questionnaire asks about what specifically you want to see improved, changed, or altered in order to engage with you differently, engage with you better and more proactively. So if you have specific comments on that, please go to those links and offer us your contributions. You will see that they're actually already posted on the chat box now. You'll see also on the screen now the guide questions that Heidi Air-Dupuis will take us through the facilitation on when we resume with the Q&A session. At the top right-hand corner, there is a 5-minute countdown timer. For those of you that wish to take a break and that will be taking a break with the rest of us, as that timer approaches 0, you'll know that it's time for us to return to the consultation. If you happen to be stepping away from your screens, there will be some background music playing. As that music begins to fade, it will be an indication to you to return to your screens because we're about to resume the consultations. So with that, let's break for 5 minutes. And when we resume, we will have the Q&A session as facilitated by Heidi Air-Dupuis. But for now, we're going to take a bit of a brief break. See you in 5 minutes. Thanks very much and welcome back, everybody. We will now have the Q&A discussion as facilitated by Heidi Eer-Dupuy, who is the head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Social Development, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. You will continue to see some guide questions flashed on the screen, which we also had during our break, but please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve SOGIESC issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement as aligned to ADB Strategy 2030 and the OP1 and OP2, as well as section C3BP from the Operations Manual, which both Oliver Chapman and Tony Jo Lebos mentioned. A reminder that you can ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen in either English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese. And a further reminder that should you wish to raise a question or share your experience anonymously, you can do so by messaging directly Jennifer de Bellin or Niel Aquino. And Jennifer or Niel will repost your question or share your experience under their own name, which will protect your identity and offer you anonymity. And then, as I mentioned before the break, please join us for a quick series of event evaluations before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn for the wrap up and next steps of the consultation. So with that, let me turn you over to Heidi Eer-Dupuy to moderate the Q&A session. Heidi, if you please.
Thank you, Azim, and thank you very much, participants, for being with us today and to discuss this very, very important topic for our safeguards review. We have already one question that's posed to us from Dipti Karan Weiss. So Dipti, please come in and ask your question. Hello. Okay. I think we'll come back to Dipti then. We have next a question from Wang Shu. Wang Shu, are you there? Please come in with your questions.
Hi. Yes. Should I go now with the question that I posted in the chat box? Okay. Yes, so yes. So there are currently 244 active ADB projects in China, and 182 of these projects include the theme, which is the driver of change of gender equity and mainstreaming, which I assume is inclusive of SOGIESC. But how can local civil society organizations working on SOGIESC issues and gender equality engage and contribute to the monitoring of SOGIESC safeguards in these projects? Because under these project documents, there are currently no safeguards posted. So we don't know how we're able to engage or monitor or be a part of the process. Or alternatively, is there any in-country ADB presence in China that engages with civil society and the monitoring of safeguards in each thematic group that can facilitate this engagement? Thank you.
Thank you, Wang Shu. So you're asking questions about gender equity mainstreaming as it's labeled on the projects and how civil society group can engage. We have with us our colleagues from the gender team who can actually explain more about the projects on and the gender equity mainstreaming. So I'll invite Ms. Malika to come in on this one. And then if our colleagues Madhu after that would like to add to the discussion as well from the social side. Thank you.
Thank you. If I correctly understand the question, it's actually related to both on how civil society organizations can be engaged in the monitoring on safeguards related provisions, but also in the gender action plans. So for the gender action plans, during the project design, when we develop the gender action plan, which is specific for projects, we explore opportunities for engagement with civil society organizations, both in terms of support of implementation. For example, if we are planning to have capacity building activities for which the expertise from the local CSOs will be very valuable, then the terms of reference will be specifically included in the project design, and the CSO organizations will be engaged to implement this part. We're also collaborating with the CSOs during the consultations as a part of the due diligence to seek of their views and to hear the voices of those who they are representing. And this work is usually done as a part of preparation for the project and part of the preparation of the poverty and social and gender analysis report. In terms of engagement for monitoring of the gender action plan, so unfortunately, if this is not included in the project document at the early stage, this engagement probably will be more difficult because the sufficient budget will not be included to support the activities that will be related with the monitoring. But just to let you know that we do have a system for monitoring and reporting on the implementation of the gender action plan. This is usually done on semi-annually, on annual basis. All project teams are collecting information following the template, which is a part of the project document, and the information to demonstrate how project actions and project targets are, what is the progress in terms of achieving project actions and project targets is ongoing, to also to warn the project teams if there are any delays and to take the corrective action. We're also in touch with our executive and implementing agencies to ensure that the staff is in place. For example, most of the gender action plans have the specific provisions related to project management, which requires to have a gender specialist on board from the very beginning of the project to ensure that not only implementation, but also reporting, monitoring and reporting is ongoing from the very beginning of the project. Thank you.
Okay, Madhu, can I ask you to come in on the safeguard monitoring?
Sure. Currently, we don't have, monitoring indicators related to SOGIES issues. But in the revised policy, if we include provisions related that concerns with issues of SOGIES, then there obviously will be monitoring requirements. And how are we trying to achieve that? We are trying to achieve the risks of the forms of discrimination that might be present in the project area through a process of screening, categorizing the project based on the contextual risks. As we know, this issue is very sensitive and there are various contextual country context risks, and there are various forms of discrimination. So if we assess that there are that form of risk, and how do you understand that contextual risk? Of course, through collaboration with CSOs who are working in this area, trying and understand, or organizations or institutions, donors who work in that area to assess the contextual risks. So in the revised policy, we are thinking of having specific provisions related to safeguarding SOGIES issues. And how are we trying to do that? If you really look at ADB safeguards policy, it focuses on the definition of the vulnerable group is not very clear, in the sense it does not provide clarity in which are the groups it includes. It has a very broad definition of that. It basically would ensure any adverse impact of the ADB project that disproportionately affects any population group who are vulnerable, are defined as a vulnerable group. So what really comes during the assessment is, how do you identify who are adversely impacted by the ADB project? Who are your vulnerable groups? Who are they, huge population groups of women who have some issues? Are they, people of diverse SOGIESEC who have different forms of vulnerability? They're losing land, they are getting displaced, or they're having any other, livelihood impacts. Then Are they poor? Is there any other form of disability in their household? So all these forms of intersectionality is also assessed, and the risk of the project is categorized, and various documents, mitigation documents are prepared. And in those mitigation documents are also mentioned what indicators will be monitored, how it will be monitored, and how the reporting will take place. So what I'm trying to say is that in future, we think that we will have indicators through which we will monitor SOGIEX issues. So currently, we don't have it. We just monitor. Our safeguards are focused on involuntary settlement, indigenous people and environment. It talks about vulnerable groups, but since it has a very broad-based definition, it does not identify or detail out the specific groups, not necessarily exclude the group, but it does not go into a very detailed assessment. So first step is to include provisions in the policy. Second step is to strengthen the tools for investigation during processing, implementation, and monitoring of the project. So I'll stop here. If there are any further questions, I can also respond to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhu, and thank you, Malika. For Wangshu, have we addressed your questions?
So yes, in terms of the monitoring aspect, but also whether if there are any in-country ADB presence in China that civil society can engage with?
Yes, we do have a resident mission office in, I think, Beijing.
Okay.
Yes. So
is there?
We can send you the link here on the website on the
yeah.
in the chat.
Heidi, I would just like to add here is that we are also planning in-country consultations in China.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when we get the opportunity to visit China or, have online consultations, we would also agree with our, client on the topics that we will discuss. And definitely this can be one of the topics. So we would definitely would like to, collaborate and, share more information in terms of how practically we can really identify those issues and projects, have those appropriate mitigation measures, checks and balances, as well as, properly monitor and implement the project. We hope to have those consultations in the next 3-4 months. But as you know, having these consultations at a level with our client, it needs a lot of clearances, approvals. It takes a little bit of time. I'm sure when we have the clearances and the tentative schedule, we will get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wangshu, for your question. We have another question here posed. The participants like to thank us for the presentation and for organizing this much needed awareness consultation, and especially within the Pacific region context. And here's a, in the Pacific, there is still a strong objection towards SOGIEX group, and how can we ensure and hold accountable Pacific regional leaders and CEOs of CSOs or NGOs or other organizations in the Pacific who simultaneously are religious leaders or pastors, and how do we deal with barriers and discriminations? There could be systematic organizational barriers and other barriers that hinders SOGIEX people from the SOGIEX community from be a part of sustainable development and employment. So if I would like to turn these questions on discriminations and how we can include people in the process to Director Bruce Dunn. Bruce.
Hi, well, thank you very much, Dipati. And it's a great question to really kick off with, because it really speaks to, some of the critical issues around discrimination. And I think that really is a critical issue for us to recognize straight up that, of course, as you're saying, discrimination is real. It occurs at sort of country and individual levels for a range of reasons. Sometimes they're explicit, sometimes it's unconscious bias, of course. So it's a challenging one, but there are a range of things that we do think that we can do. Firstly, we have to continue to promote equality and non-discrimination through a whole range of international and regional forums and country forums, and through the opportunities that we have for policy dialogue. Plus, as an international organization, ADB, of course, have our own strategies and policies. And as we're discussing today, we're seeking to strengthen the inclusion around SOGI-esque issues at a proactive level, as well as within our safeguards. And that then gives us the basis to apply this as a basis for ADB providing financing and technical support in the countries that we work with. So that's maybe one thing that we can do. Another, of course, is continuing to work to develop data and knowledge and analysis, looking at the impacts of inequality and discrimination on people's lives. We've talked about this a little bit in the presentation. There is, of course, data available globally, and there is some data available in a number of countries in the region, but it's pretty patchy, and there's a lot more work that we need to do to understand the impacts of inequality and discrimination on people's lives, but also on the wider economy. And then on the other side of that, which is equally important, is looking at the benefits of inclusion, the social and economic benefits, and bring that complete perspective together for people in ways that they maybe haven't seen that data. Another is around looking at the legal barriers. So this is part of the work that we're now doing in collaboration with the World Bank, is to understand the legal barriers and to present and publicize that, not necessarily to name and shame, but to provide a proactive agenda where we can show how countries across the region are moving forward with more equality and anti-discrimination in the legal frameworks, and what can be done to address those. And that's certainly something that I think ADB and the World Bank would be happy to work with at country and regional levels in the future around providing support to change. And then maybe a last point that I'll mention just generally is sharing people's voices and supporting champions from within the LGBTQI community, but also from without it. And that's something that we do inside ADB, awareness raising internally, things like the Ida Hot Day. Also in ADB, we have a Friends of the LGBTQI community where we can come together and share voices, both inside ADB, but also outside as well. So, I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of promotion and sharing knowledge. But of course, it's something that collectively the change process will need to continue to work on. Now, I've raised just broader points, but I'm sure some of my colleagues might like to come in and perhaps add a few more specifics on some of the areas that we are working on or we can work on more. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I think our colleague Malika, would you like to add anything on the process that we have of ensuring that there is inclusion in the design of the project?
Yes, thank you, Heidi. So the operational plan for operational priority 2 on accelerating progress in gender equality highlights our, the areas of ADB's commitment, institutional commitment on where we want to continue our work and enhance our work. And one of these areas is ADB support, to eliminate harmful social norms and gender norms and practices that still exist in some of our countries. And they are very strongly associated with gender social norms, right? In which, the values are kind of attached to boys over girls. And gendered social norms and stereotypes also influence the expectations on, how women and girls or how men and boys should behave, and what is the normal versus abnormal or subnormal, and often also inhibit, these are inhibit acceleration of progress in gender equality. So in the operational plan, 2ADB is committed to have proactive measures and to assess how the gendered norms and stereotypes might interface with our interventions. And we also have to look at the opportunities on how we can address these issues. How we can address this issue. We're also working quite actively, to support the legal and institutional and governance reforms to remove gender discriminatory provisions. We quite actively working, for example, with our communication colleagues to promote the role of men and boys, women and girls, in gender equality, and also design several behavioral change campaigns through education and skills training and public campaigns. And we have, very good experience in preventing gender-based violence, on how to change the overall attitudes and the behavioral change campaigns that were developed specifically to address issues on the gender-based violence in urban context. So in OP2, we are committed to better capture the role of media, in more effective behavioral change communication. And we also committed to engage countries through the evidence-based policy dialogue, to obtain their greater buy-in, because addressing, like when we bring in the new areas, to ensure that there is an understanding of the importance of these issues, we have to bring in data, we have to bring in some evidence on how this would affect the overall country development. And for this, we are also engaging in some technical assistance projects, some pilot projects to build this evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. And thank you for that question that actually is a very important one that addresses discrimination and the process procedures that we can ensure our projects will be inclusive. I think Tony Zhou would like to come in as well to share a little bit about the areas of work that's being done in this domain. Go ahead, Tony Zhou.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in quickly and kind of complement what Malika was saying. So beyond, the behavioral change, which is absolutely required and helps mitigate a lot of these risks, it's also important to stress the importance of conducting consultations with local sexual and gender minorities in countries to better understand the challenges that they are facing and where these challenges are occurring in order to prevent this kind of exclusion or discrimination. As an example, I've worked on a social protection, for instance, program, not related to the ADB, where, the enrollment to be able to receive payments by the government was led by a community leader. So each community leader for their own town. And, after consultation, you can understand why some community leaders might be, excluding sexual and gender minorities. So having that kind of detailed understanding can only come from meaningful consultations with civil society in the country. And that would also help mitigate those risks, because we can understand better the process of how discrimination is occurring and how better inclusive projects can be designed from the get-go to prevent these kind of things happening. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the question and to the answers that we received. I think it's a very, very comprehensive. Next we have Ramil, who raised Ramil, who has a hand raised, I think, in the list here. Ramil, please go ahead. Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Ramil Andag, GSC Rights Officer. Sorry. GSC Rights Officer at ATCOM. We're based in Bangkok, but we work regionally in the Asia and Pacific region on LGBTQI health and rights. And Oliver and Tony Zhou did a very good work on establishing why the need for GSC inclusion in the safeguards. And just to say also that the same has been born in researches done by civil society organizations working on LGBTQI, including APCOM, and that there are disproportionate effects on LGBTQI people on health, education, work, which are related to LGBTQI stigma discrimination. And I would like to take this opportunity also to raise the position that the ADB safeguards policy has to have explicit provision for SOGIESC, because if there's no explicit provision for SOGIESC, the invisibility in data, in tools, in processes and mechanisms might continue. LGBTQI communities are traditionally not looked into when we think of programs, because programs are still designed binary. So there should be explicit references to SOGIESC inclusion in the policy, in the safeguards policy as an overarching statement perhaps. And then Oliver already mentioned that one of the suggestions which came out prior was a standalone instrument. And also to say that perhaps ADB can reflect on recognizing that safeguards is basically do no harm, but how can also ADB reflect on safeguards as an instrument of from doing no harm to being increasingly progressive, to being increasingly progressively inclusive. Because in especially on services, on aspects which are service aspects, service provision is also not. There are exclusions in service provision experienced by LGBTQI, and I think that this has been highlighted during COVID, and country organizations working on LGBTQI can perhaps share about this later, like in designing programs for assistance, LGBTQI families would not be included just because they're not traditionally considered as families. LGBTQI people would not be able to access services because of documentary requirements. And some of us do not necessarily have this, or our documents do not align with our identities. So these can be some of the things which can be looked into. And also, I would like to raise that in terms of monitoring and safeguards, we should be cognizant that most in-country existing legislations are not cognizant of LGBTQI, nor are they protective. So how do we ensure grievance and reporting mechanism at ADB which are accessible, safe, and secure for LGBTQI communities? What else? Recognizing also intersectionality. There are SOGIESC intersects with a lot of other issues and identifiers, and how do we reflect this in the safeguards? Maybe I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. You've given us quite a lot to think about. I would like to turn this over to my colleague Madhu first, and then Bruce to talk to the do no harm component. But I think there's a component on the progressive inclusion and the social inclusion side, and to be cognizant of that. So I'd like to turn over to Madhu for addressing that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramil, for raising very, very important and crucial points, and the need of the hour also to ensure we have very socially inclusive project design for SOGIESC people, and as well as also ensure how, as you mentioned, to be increasingly progressive, and ensure how we achieve better measures of social inclusion. Now, we have to also see it from the perspective of the different strategies and policies that ADB have. So let me use this opportunity to explain, how ADB handles the proactive agenda for these kinds of issues, as well as how we deal with the adverse impacts for environmental and social in the safeguard policy. So we have to also be mindful that safeguard policy is about the do no harm, and we have to ensure we have a clear delineation between the do good and the do no harm. If we mix the both, it might give us problem, but there is a need to have these two things actually move in the right direction and at a proper time. So in a project context, what happens is there is one stream of work that goes on in every project in ADB, what we call the initial poverty social analysis, which really looks into issues of social vulnerabilities, gender issues, disproportionate impacts, adverse impacts, which are the intersectionality, all. So it happens through a process of an initial social screening process, from where we can map out in our project area who are our beneficiaries, who are adversely affected, which are the population groups that we have. And then further down, we also do what we call a poverty social analysis, where we go deeper into this analysis. And as you mentioned, that how are we going to address these intersectionality issues? So this is also one way of doing your analysis, and it is done through a process of quantitative data collection from the various population groups in the project area that ADB is financing, as well as through a proper broad-based stakeholder consultation, through obviously stakeholder identification, analysis, and consultation. So to answer to your point, it is during that time, as well as during preparation of the safeguard documentation, one can really take into consideration these intersectionalities, vulnerabilities. And once you get to know what issues really are in your project, you can also develop measures for a more proactive agenda and better inclusion in your gender action plans, in your social development action plans, which deals with the do-good aspect of that ADB project. Now, there is the other stream of work that goes on, which is on the safeguards, which means maybe you have a population of 500, out of which maybe 100 are affected by negative impacts, like somebody losing land, somebody losing their house. So then you have a subset of population where your safeguards policy apply, and you really ensure that no harm is caused. You are able to, whatever you try to minimize, and if you cannot minimize, you try to ensure that you mitigate those impacts. And within that context, you also again get into assessments of, okay, if this is a household, as you mentioned, issues of getting services, like opportunities maybe for project work. What would be the documentation requirements? So these issues will come up through the consultation, and adequate measures will be ensured in those documentation that these things are considered and people are not discriminated. Moreover, I also agree that explicit provisions in the safeguard policy for provisions for, safeguarding the risks to people with diverse SOGIEC is important. And we at this stage, we are thinking of basically broadening the definition of vulnerable groups by making specific reference to SOGIEC people. But as you know, this is a very sensitive topic. And we have to have this discussion with the DMCs and how it is going to be worded in the policy. So, and as well as putting the provisions of safeguards in various standards that we would have in our safeguard policy. So once we have those standards, little provisions of non-discrimination, provisions of inclusion in stakeholder engagement, ensuring they are identified and consulted on the mitigation measures, on the livelihood restoration options, or whatever needs to be designed to safeguard them from the negative impacts. There will be monitoring, there will be adequate grievance mechanisms also designed so that a safer space can be created for them to view so that they can put their opinion there, as well as how grievances can be tracked and recorded. Now, as we know, there is a lot to learn from all of you who are already working there, also to guide us during our project preparation on what will the best suited method of grievance mechanism, best suited mitigation measure when we actually prepare our safeguard documentation. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that it's a lot about a mutual learning exercise that we have to go through once we are able to have those explicit provisions in the policy. Heidi, I would stop here. I hope I have been answered most of your questions. Ramil,
at this point, I'd like to ask Bruce if there's any additional issues he would like to add to. I think particularly the do no harm discussion and the grievance. Bruce, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Heidi. And thank you so much to Ramil. I really appreciated the comments that you made. I mean, firstly, these consultations are very good for us to hear and understand, issues. And you spoke about, some of the challenges that people from the LGBTQI community have been facing, say, during the COVID-19 period. And this is something that we've been sharing experiences actually inside ADB through various forums, and it's important for us to hear and learn from. And I think clearly it points to the need for a wider approach. Now, Madhu has been speaking about both how we may look at a sort of a proactive agenda to support poverty, social inclusion more actively in ADB's strategy. So that's something that we are working towards. And then secondly, in the safeguards, which is focused more on the do no harm agenda, and then ultimately how those two things link. So I try not to repeat too much of that, but one thing that I did want to add is, yes, so we recognise the need for inclusion of SOGI-S issues in the new policy framework. And we are still considering whether that's best done through a separate or standalone standard, looking at gender and SOGI-S issues, or whether to integrate within the policy. But I think clearly it needs to be there explicitly at the level of objectives and then down through the standards. In terms of the safeguard standards, and you spoke about intersectionality, which is also a clear issue, we need to actually have linkage cascading through the policy from a more integrated approach to environmental or social assessment, and then looking at various different topics that come up through the safeguards. So we'll be adding a new standard actually on labour and working conditions. So clearly in terms of labour, we need to make sure that we've got the opportunities for all, that there's non-discrimination in hiring practices, that everyone should have opportunities for work. We also need to make sure that there's workplaces that are free of discrimination and that people would have opportunities through worker-focused grievance redress mechanisms to be able to raise issues in a way that should be free of retaliation. At wider levels, of course, there are other safeguard standards such as how we go about stakeholder engagement and meaningful consultation. Tony Jo mentioned that earlier. That's absolutely critical. Another would be around looking at resettlement, land acquisition and resettlement processes and impacts on livelihoods. So we need clear integration there. Community health and safety, that whole aspect again has to have integration as well. The grievance redress mechanisms more widely for a project. So, I think there's a range of areas that we need to look at. But the next challenge moving forward for us is, of course, getting the policy right, but then going forward in terms of the policy tools and implementation. And honestly, that's where we're going to need your help and further recommendations and collaboration, with government partners, but with civil society as well, to see how we can do this in an effective way. So very, very keen to have, further recommendations actually on the implementation challenges and how we may go about addressing some of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to invite Oliver to speak to the legal aspects of the question. Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. And thanks very much, Ramil, for all those points that you made. And as you know, you're on our steering group for our legal barriers study. So thanks so much, all the inputs there. And just to say, we've actually had inputs from literally hundreds of organizations in the different countries in which the study is taking place. So it just shows the value of all those inputs we're getting. And I think you raised really important points around, for example, lack of kind of correct documentation for many transgender people as one example. And that's why the granularity of that study is so important. I think, the risk-based issues that you mentioned isn't just about do no harm, because of course do no harm is do no harm and our projects, but these risks are faced by people across society in our DMC. So I think, the next stage from this kind of study is to look at, one is policy dialogue, which is something that ADB does a lot of and quite successfully in terms of helping governments to launch reform agendas. And that will be, again, something we're looking to work with civil society on, and also then on potential project entry points as well. And that's why we focused on things like education, where we can really see, practical reforms that might be helpful. So just to give you a bit of a kind of context for why we're doing the legal barriers study and how it fits into the points you're making. That's you, buddy.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Ramil, for your questions. Thank you, Oliver, Madhu, Bruce, for your answers. We have two questions that are related to each other. Krishna asked about how CSO or NGOs can participate in the country consultation, and then Kong Yara from Cambodia asked if there will be any in-country consultation for Cambodia. Can Bruce answer this question, please? Thank you. Over to you, Bruce.
Yes, sure, actually. And thank you, Komyara. I was actually starting to reply in the chat, but hadn't quite finished as yet. So firstly, we are, as you've seen in the chat box, planning to go forward with the next stage that would involve consultations in 11 countries initially. It has been a little bit challenging to put this together at the moment because of the issues with COVID-19 and access. We would have normally traveled a lot more, but things are starting to open up now. So we're looking forward to getting out and visiting a range of countries. So far in the initial list, we do not have Cambodia included. However, we are keeping that under review, and we're looking potentially to add at least one further country in the Mekong region to make sure that we've got coverage. And we're aware, actually, we've had great participation in these sessions from Cambodia, including from government and civil society. So, I can certainly see good interest and specific issues and opportunities to include there. But it's something we'll have to review further, just with access and for setting up the opportunities to travel there. So thank you for raising that. And we will be keeping in touch with everyone on the planning for these trips through our website. And of course, feel free to reach out to us if you'd like further information. Thanks, Heidi. Back to you.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. Terima kasih to Krishna and Okun Charan Kong Yara. I think it's time now to go to call again for questions. I think we posted the 5 questions earlier for you to look at if you have anything relating to those 5 questions. So would you or you like to suggest answers or raise some issues that we may not have discussed already, please raise your hand and we will call on you to speak with us and let us know if there's any issues that you want to inform us on. I think we've also received a couple of questions ahead of time. We have Jing Cristobal, who asked a question ahead of time. Would you like to speak and raise your question now, Jing?
You can ask the question.
So the question is, how will we ensure that the guide safeguard, I guess you're referring to the safeguards work we're working on, will be enforced in countries where there are laws against LGBTQI persons. So how to overcome legal constraints and legal barriers, I think, is the question. I think it's speaking to the safeguard issue and overcoming that. So I'll address this one to Madhu. If you can address how we can overcome that in the context of safeguards, if we have some requirements that we put forward in the safeguards, how would that be addressed in the context of where there's difficulties for people living with people actually of LGBTQI community? Thank you, Madhu.
Thanks, Heidi. And this is a very important question, and I think this issue is faced by many of our DMCs. And the point that you raised is definitely one of the challenges that we are going to face. Even we have very explicit provisions in the policy, but we have to find a way to work, move ahead. Now, how do we see this? In the revised policy, what we are trying to see is categorize projects, not only on the basis of the physical impacts, but also do an assessment of the borrower's capacity and track record, how the borrower actually implements safeguards in the country, as well as the contextual risk factors. Now, the point that you have raised would flag in the contextual risk factors, because when we see that the country does not have laws that actually safeguard the rights of LGBTQI communities, automatically that will be flagged as a kind of a risk, which means we would have to have that dialogue with our client. Because if the client is borrowing money from ADB, the safeguard policy will apply, and the provisions in the policy have to be implemented. So first step is have the explicit provisions in the policy, assess the risk of the country where things like this will be flagged right up front, and then have a dialogue with your client that these are the provisions in the policy, and they will be also reflected in the various documents as well as in the loan agreement, and it will be implemented and monitored. So this is one discussion. While at the same time, from the proactive agent of ADB, ADB will also have to make a concerted effort of awareness building of our clients on these issues. And to help with that, what we really look for is this, study that Oliver is leading on the legal barriers, along with World Bank, in terms of raising the awareness of our clients in terms of the issues and the discrimination that one might face, the social stigma that is attached, and how best these services, whatever services the project provide, how designs can be inclusive, how vulnerable people can be protected. All these measures and mitigation measures are included in the relevant safeguard documents, and how we will regularly monitor those indicators to ensure that things happen, as well as a lot of capacity building and training and awareness building, even for those implementing agencies who would actually implement the project. So there are various levels. You do a kind of more awareness building at a more country level. Then when you go to the project level, you build awareness of your executing agencies, implementing agencies in collaboration with people who are knowledgeable about this issue like you in the field, as well as followed by very detailed social impact assessment and proper documentation and a trail that you can monitor and implement. So this is the only way. I'm not saying that this will always be successful, but once we keep trying, I know things will improve. Like when we started 15 years back for our resettlement policy, we had hiccups, but we progressed. So I think we all have to make that effort together on this. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Madhu. Have we addressed your question, Ying? Ying, if you have any other follow-up, if not, if we've answered all the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for answering. At the same time, I also agree with Ramil's suggestion that unlike having a policy statement, it would be good to have like an ADB overall inclusion of SOGIE-SC in its policy statement, so that in all policies, in all safeguards, in all kinds of programs, SOGIE-SC is already included, not just under the sexual abuse, exploitation, abuse, and harassment only. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We have a follow-up question from Kong Yara on how ADB, how SOGIE's topic can be engaged at the Cambodia level with ADB in Cambodia context. I would like to ask Madhu to come in on this one to maybe share a little bit how we engage at the country office level. Thank you, Madhu.
Yeah. See, as part of the policy update, we can be sure that at the country level, if there is a demand from the CSO communities in Cambodia, that you would want to have a separate consultation in terms of raising these issues, we can definitely have a discussion, because we understand that the country contexts are very different. So your feedback obviously is very, very important to us. We also have a resident mission in Cambodia. And as explained in my previous response, when we have the revised policy, currently in our ADB projects, we have not highlighted this issue in that manner. But when we have the new policy and we have the projects processed under the new policy, we'll have provisions where this issue will be monitored, and there would be, a kind of a policy dialogue that will happen. And there has to be a forum where these issues are discussed and thrashed out and agreed. As I know the Cambodia government, and I've worked in a couple of projects with them, certain things can be agreed up front. For example, if SOGIE-SC gets included in their safeguards policy. And as we know, the Cambodia government also has what they call the standard operating procedures for projects that they finance by MFIs. They might decide based on the discussion to actually update their SOP. We don't know. But once we have our revised policy, we will also have a renewed dialogue with the governments. And we will also have the opportunity of further discussion when we actually share the draft policy paper with our board and our DMC members over there. So there are opportunities, and there will be opportunities in the future for that discussion. Currently in our list of in-country consultation, we don't have Cambodia, but consultations specific to SOGIE, which can be organized in Indonesia, we can always have a session for Cambodia. It's possible to actually, invite you all for that discussion. I mean, I would obviously, also ask Bruce whether, if we could do that. But I think that would be a good thing that we can do. If people are interested, we can include them in our consultations more on a regional level.
And if Bruce and Madhu are going to Cambodia, I'm going to. I miss home. Haven't been home in a long time. So yes, thank you for your question, Kong Yara. And we have a hand raised here. Yancy Peng. Over to you, Yancy.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm Yanzi from LGBT Rights Advocacy China. Thank you for all the efforts. I have a suggestion actually. And I think when we see the Asian Pacific country as a whole, when we review all the standard and law and policies, we can see there are so many limitations and lack of legal protection. But I think it's necessary, along with the country consultation, more research are needed to address the need from different countries. I think there are different needs from the different countries and also different strategy to deal with the difficulty, the boundary. Like, for example, like when we work on the legal issue in China, we don't have any especially law and regulation protecting LGBT community, and people are suffering from the violence and discrimination. And however, from the effort from the civil society organization, we can see there are some progress from the Chinese courts ruling against employment discrimination based on SOGI and HIV. So we can see some transgender employment discrimination case and conversion therapy case have good results. I think it's necessary to ask for help from the local LGBT organization to review or provide suggestion in different countries when implementing the safeguard policy. Like ADB invests millions of dollars to China every year. The projects are focusing on like public health, education, and construction. I think it's necessary that ADB introduced adopting a standalone SOGI gender safeguard, and invite. It's very important to invite the LGBT organization to give suggestion how to implement it with different strategy. It's good for different countries. Yeah, that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your suggestion. I will ask Oliver to come in to share a little bit about the legal research and the need for more contextual information. Oliver?
Thanks, Heidi, and yeah, thanks very much for the question. Yeah, I mean, similar to when Ramil was talking earlier, I think the points you raised are really important. There are very different contexts. Actually, PRC, People's Republic of China, is one of the countries we're covering in the study. And so, yeah, you certainly get different kind of picture of what's going on in terms of the approach to discrimination. For example, some countries have a more kind of active approach, but others, like there is a kind of a really a lack of anything either positive or negative, and I think that's the case with PRC. So yeah, absolutely, I'm looking at the entry points that we can find from this research into our future policy dialogue and also projects as well. So yeah, not too much to add at the moment. I wonder if Bruce or Maddie would like to talk about the safeguards aspect of this.
Oliver, yeah, I'd like to come in. I thought it was a really important point from Yancy. You know, thank you very much for joining today and sharing those thoughts. A big issue that's been on our mind is to how to go from a policy framework to an implementation framework. Yeah. Your point around the context being different in the countries, obviously the legal frameworks are different, and that's an area that Oliver and ADB is working on with the studies in partnership with the World Bank. But then the context for implementation is another issue. And I would very much appreciate advice. I'll have to take this back to our colleagues and discuss more, but you know, maybe a follow-up consultation forum specifically on implementation issues with maybe a focus group that could help us understand more and think about the implementation challenges ahead would be very much appreciated. So I just thank you for that recommendation, and it's something that we can discuss more. Back to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Bruce. I think there's a couple of questions that can be addressed directly. One was a question of whether or not there would be a consultation in Taiwan. And then And then the next question, follow up from Ramil, is will the country consultation be SOGS specific? The consultations of the countries that ADB will conduct consultations in will post it in the chat. But will there be any specific one in Taiwan, and whether it would be SOGS specific? So to you, Bruce.
Yes, thank you, Heidi. And thank you, Sean Du. Appreciate your questions. Currently, with the 11 countries that we've got listed, that's sort of the number of countries that we think is feasible at the moment with the resources and the access constraints that we have. We've been taking the approach to have these wider regional consultations to be fully inclusive across the region. We have 48 member countries and 68 countries that are members of ADB more broadly, 48 developing member countries. And it's challenging for us to get around to all of the countries that we work with. So we're doing these regional consultations to provide broader coverage, but then we'll be doing approximately 11 countries at this stage, although we may try and add more. So currently not a plan for Taiwan, I'm sorry. Then on the question of country consultations being focused on SOGS, I think there is a potential for us to do that. What we've proposed to do is to first have some initial dialogue with our developing member country at the country level, as well as with civil society, to set a range of topics. We would be holding workshops with government around existing policy implementation and policy directions, and then we would propose to have one or a series of short workshops with civil society on different topics that are of interest. For some countries, we've started to develop up a list, and for others, we're yet to begin. But I do think we should look at SOGS issues in at least some of those countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for raising those questions, our participants. At this point, I'd like to remind everyone that we're coming close to noon here in Manila, and I think in the Asia Pacific, Asia time zone. I think for some of you in the Pacific, maybe earlier. But this is a time now to call to see if there's any interest from our participants to speak or share any informations or discuss or ask any questions. Please let us know. This is the last call for questions, and if you would like to speak, please raise your hand. You're also welcome to post chat. But even after the consultation is finished here, you're welcome to email us. I think Jennifer sent the email address in the chat earlier today. So
Heidi, just while we're waiting for any other participants to share any further views, I just thought I'd raise one issue and might invite Madhu or one of our other colleagues to just speak to it. Just privately in the chat, one participant had reached out to me and was raising some issues around disability inclusion and the intersectionality issues with SOGS, and of course the barriers that can be in place for both people with disabilities and for people of different sexual orientation and gender identity. And obviously you put those combination of factors together and it really can be difficult for people to get meaningful employment or face other forms of discrimination. Madhu, would you like to just briefly speak to that? Again, of course, we're looking at a broad-based approach that looks at poverty and social analysis and inclusion more broadly. But how might we go about sort of looking at intersectionality more in the context of the policy and disability in particular?
Yeah, I mean, as I explained earlier, Bruce, and to all of you, that we have these two processes, one which works for the do-good for the project, which improves the project design per se, looks into the inclusion, that the project designs in ADB are inclusive. So currently what we are really doing is trying to strengthen the poverty social analysis process, while at the same time, also trying to see how those analyses can capture the different vulnerabilities that exist, along with the intersectionality issues. It can be SOGIESC plus disability. And then if you put another layer of data, which is safeguards, for example, somebody loses land and loses the entire land, what happens in terms of livelihood? Like, okay, you have to, which means, for example, just give one example. If this is the case where in a project we find somebody is losing the entire land and has to be relocated and has disability, so what can be done? So during firstly, obviously, designing the stakeholder consultation process in a manner that listens to the person's choices, very important, and the problems and the issues that one faces. Based on that, design a program for relocation and livelihood restoration. So what can that be? It can be that if one moves to a relocation site, maybe, in a lot of the countries, government builds resettlement houses. Maybe that resettlement housing needs to have universal design, and people with disability might need to be allocated, the lower floors, the ground floor. If there are many more, elevators should be accessible. If it's a high rise, because a lot of the times, if you look at China, the resettlement housing I think there are 15 floors in there, or sometimes even 8 floors if it's a mid-level housing. So, those designs, can be incorporated in the safeguard plan, as well as depends on the sector of the project. If there are ways in which, they can be, included in employment opportunities and office jobs, which can be done based on the skill set, of course. As part, if you're an affected person as per the SPS, you'll also have support for livelihood restoration. And there are various forms that one can work through it. One try to look for linkages to government programs that exist for people with disability to ensure that that discrimination is not there and that linkages happen, as well as project-specific training, design opportunities, business opportunities that the compensation as well the various trainings can provide for the livelihood restoration part. So what we are also trying to do in the process is also improve our social impact assessment tools. So we capture all these vulnerabilities and the intersectionality issues. Because as we always say, unless you have a baseline, you cannot really design your program, even your monitoring indicators. Plus, on top of that, if you don't have a proper stakeholder engagement planning process, and in terms of having those specific discussions on those specific problems, you will also not come to the right solutions. And that's where I emphasize discussion with the CSO partners, because in the local context, they really know best what works and what doesn't. So that collaboration is very important, and that knowledge exchange. ADB's knowledge of safeguards implementation for many years, as well as how can we combine SOGIESC issues with overlaying different kinds of intersectionality vulnerabilities that can happen and work together, which can actually disproportionately affect the person much, much more. So, but the first thing, as I always say, is actually flagging the risk first in the project. So it's a long process. You screen, you see the risk, you understand the risk, you do the assessment, establish a baseline, you understand your vulnerability, intersectionality issues, have a very strong stakeholder consultation, design your mitigation plan, implement, monitor. So this is how the cycle works, obviously with very explicit provisions in the policy, which gives ADB staff as well as the client to understand what it means to implement these issues. Yeah.
Thank you. I look at the time now. I think we are at the top of the hour, and we've come to the next part of our session. Thank you very much, everyone, for typing in your questions, raising your hands, and for actively engaging on this topic. We really appreciate all of your participations and your comments. I think some of you made some really, really in-depth contribution. You can still continue to make your contributions by emailing us. Jennifer had posted the email address in the chat. Please send us materials, research, publication if you have anything that you think it would be helpful. And we thank you very much for your time today. And with that, I'd like to conclude the Q&A session and turn it back to Asim. Asim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Oliver Chapman, Dr. Tony Jo Lebos, Madhumita Gupta, Malika Shagazatova, and of course, Bruce Dunn, as well as others I may have unintentionally missed. And that includes those from the events management and SCP teams. Thank you all so much. But of course, a special and huge thanks to you all, our participants and informants, for providing your feedback, the constructive engagement, for sharing your insightful comments, offering clear questions, and the constructive experiences that you also shared. I want to reiterate that the comments on the SOGIESC issues in Asia and the Pacific that are received from this consultation will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. And as Heidi mentioned, and as Jennifer has posted in the chat, if you have further contributions and interventions, please feel free to make them through email. The email address is posted in the chat box. Please don't go yet. On your screen, we would love to hear how this event met your expectations and responded to your needs. If you could give this particular consultation a rating or a rank between 1 and 5, 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest, based on your level of satisfaction, we'd love to feed that back to you and what other participants also felt today. So very quickly and almost intuitively, if you can give this consultation a rank of between 1 and 5, based on your overall level of satisfaction, we can feed that back to you and let you know what not only you, but perhaps some others also felt. And there are, as I mentioned, 2 additional polls that I would like to refer you to, both of which are in the chat box and linked there now. The first is a Menti.com poll, which helps elaborate on why you provided a score of between 1 and 5 to this particular consultation and your satisfaction of this consultation. And then the second is a post-event questionnaire, which assesses or determines what you were expecting before going into this consultation versus what you actually achieved or received as a result of it. I'd be grateful, and we would all be grateful, if you could kindly complete both of those questionnaires, the links to which are in the chat box, and we will then be able to move on to a wrap-up from Bruce Dunn, who will provide us with a summary of what we've heard today, as well as walk us through the next steps. We have 1 additional consultation later this evening. But for now, I'd like to ask Jen to flash the results of the Zoom poll on the screen so we can all see whether you rated, oh, here we are. Okay, so we have 90% rating this particular consultation as highly satisfactory or somewhat satisfactory, with about 10% ranking it as neutral. All of those feedbacks are greatly appreciated, and we would particularly appreciate if you broke them down a little bit more and provided us some detail through using the poll for the Menti.com link that's in the chat box, and tell us why you felt it was highly satisfactory, somewhat satisfactory, or neutral, and offer us some advice for improving the levels of satisfaction and engagement on this particular consultation and future ones like it. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn to walk us through the next steps and provide us a summary of what we heard today. So Bruce, back over to you, please.
Hey, thank you very much, Azim, and huge thanks to everyone that's participated today. I found it very interesting and stimulating with the issues that are being raised. Obviously very critical and important for both the proactive agenda at ADB and then specifically for the work that we're doing right now on the update of the Safeguards Policy Statement. Let me start by just trying to very briefly summarize some of the key points that were raised today. And I apologize if I'm not able to capture all the key issues. But as Azim has mentioned, we will be making a more detailed summary of the session. Firstly, I just want to recognize the need to work actively to promote equality and non-discrimination across the region. This is something that ADB can play a role in, promoting awareness, studies on areas such as understanding the legal barriers, and then supporting, where appropriate, legal and institutional reforms, as well as other analytical work on the social and economic impacts of discrimination and the benefits of inclusion. So this is an important, more strategic and long-term approach for ADB to take forward. Then in the context of the safeguard policy, we've had recommendations, clearly from everyone that we do need to have specific SOGI-esque provisions and requirements in the new safeguard policy. And some have suggested that a separate standard would be useful. This is something that we're looking at. And obviously these consultations are important for us to think about how to frame that, as well as looking at the experiences of other multilateral financial institutions. Next, I mentioned that in the context of the safeguards, we do need to have an integrated approach. The SOGI-esque agenda does need to link across all of the relevant safeguard standards, and that needs to recognize clearly the importance of intersectionality. For example, the relationships between SOGI-esque and poverty, ethnicity, and disability, just to name a few. And we've spoken from the ADB side about how we believe that this can be supported through strengthening of the poverty and social analysis work that we do, which provides an analytical framework to firstly understand the range of people and different groups that are present in the project areas, and to understand how projects may affect them, what would be some of the risks, particularly to vulnerable, disadvantaged or marginalized people and communities, as well as the opportunities for engagement. And that provides a basis then for further more detailed work on social impact assessment and project design, as well as risk management in the safeguards. Moving ahead, we also need to recognize the different country contexts. A number of you have raised this issue and the challenges of working in different countries, particularly those with explicit legal barriers. But I think across the region also, even where there's been policy reform and those barriers have come down, there is still a lot to do. And obviously we need to have differentiated approaches in the countries that we're working with. And a clear policy framework will give us the basis to do that. But then we need to tailor, obviously, at the implementation level. Now, a prerequisite for supporting this is the need for meaningful consultations with sexual and gender minorities to understand more on the impacts of barriers and exclusion and discrimination on their lives, and to understand more around how projects can be made more inclusive. I think also how consultation processes can be made more effective and inclusive as well is an area that we need to learn more on. And for consultations, it was also recommended that ADB should include SOGI-esque focused consultations as part of this policy update. We're here today, but we can also consider perhaps further focus groups or country consultations as we move forward with that next stage of the process. Another issue that came up early in the consultation was on, of course, you have a policy framework. We do work already around gender mainstreaming and safeguards, but there is a need for a clear monitoring framework and indicators. And there was clearly a recommendation and interest for civil society participation in that process. And then lastly, I'll mention the need for capacity development. This cuts across still within ADB. We need to strengthen our staffing and build greater awareness and support for implementation, but also in the developing member countries where we work with our clients and providing, of course, the awareness raising, but also hands-on training on things that need to be included to make the policy effective. So look, a pretty broad range of issues that have been raised today, and I've just covered a number of the key high-level issues, but we very much appreciate, we've been listening carefully, and I want to thank everyone that's joined for your points raised and suggestions, which have all been extremely valid. Then just quickly on next steps. So we are moving towards the completion of these wider regional consultations. We will then be going into a stage of some follow-up country consultations, as has been mentioned, and we've shared the initial or tentative list in the chat box today. That will be rolling out mostly from July, August, and September this year. And in addition to that, we haven't mentioned actually today, but we are also piloting some project consultations with project-affected people from past and ongoing projects, so that we can, down at the local level, at the grassroots level, understand the experiences that people have had with project implementation and how it's affected their lives. So we are doing it more, and this will be feeding into the policy development. At this stage, we expect to have a first draft of the policy available by about September or October this year. That will then go out for public consultation, and then we will be following up further next year with more opportunities for engagement before we take any final policy to our board. So thank you again for joining, and we look forward to the opportunity to meet you again in future consultations. And until then, please stay safe and well. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.